Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Boost Your Biology podcast. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined in with a fellow biohacker and entrepreneur, Angela Foster. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Lucas. It's great to be here.
Awesome.
Thanks for having me on.
Awesome. Angela, do you want to let my listeners know maybe a bit about your journey? I know briefly we're just touching on, your past, but maybe, fill my listeners in about your journey.
Yeah, sure. So I started life, not really started life, but for many years I was a corporate lawyer in London at a very big law firm. Literally, as you can imagine, as a corporate lawyer doing multinational deals, I was working super long hours, completely disrespected sleep, which is crazy now because that's kind of the foundation of many of my programs. But we were sort of forced really more than anything into working all-nighters, pulling them off, night after night to get the deal through. I then went into investment banking for a bit. So I had this background in this corporate career. And I then had this sort of first foray with my health, if you like, when I was diagnosed in my late 20s with insulin resistance and PCOS and endometriosis. And it was a bit of a shock. But I had a very strong family history of type 2 diabetes. But still, I started to understand the link between PCOS and diabetes and insulin resistance and a kind of carbohydrate tolerance. But I was sort of figuring this out because I was still practicing as a lawyer. And obviously with the medical community, they just prescribe you metformin, which obviously admittedly is actually quite a good drug for longevity. But I couldn't tolerate it at all. It gave me very bad gastric distress. So I had to have quite a bit of surgery. And that was my first kind of brush. And I was thinking, wow, this feels really young. What am I doing wrong here? So I was kind of busy researching, but still practicing, very much into exercise, but not really a limited amount of healthy eating, but by no means biohacking. So I kind of carried on and then made partnership in a large law firm when I was 8 months pregnant. So it was all kind of crazy, chaotic. Went off on maternity leave and then really struggled with postnatal depression. I fell pregnant again. So I was 3 months pregnant by the time I was due to go back off maternity leave, which was quicker than I'd expected. And it was just kind of chaotic. Here I was at home, with two little ones, changing nappies and things. It was a completely different world, a far cry from the world of corporate law. And it was very unexpected for me because I struggled very badly with postnatal depression. And that actually got successively worse until after my third child, I was pretty much so burnt out. And I just had these thoughts of suicide that just kept coming and they were so prevalent. And I felt so trapped. I was really just trying to run away from myself. And I ended up hospitalized with double pneumonia, rushed into hospital with suspected lung cancer after a chest x-ray because my lymph glands were so swollen that they thought it was lung cancer, even though I had these very high fevers and I was very sick. And I was treated for that. And I felt really, really lucky to be alive. And that was like a really pivotal moment in my life because here I was kind of attracting really what I'd been thinking about, which was the end of my life because I was struggling with my own head and everything that was going on and the depression. And that sparked in me just this moment really of, I need to get healthy. I need to really understand. And that started this quest because it began as, you can have high performance. And this happens with a lot of high performers. They really burn themselves out and they do suffer a lot with anxiety and depression more than they speak about. And then you can have people who are really, really healthy. And a lot of people that are high performing will turn around in, careers like medicine or accounting or law will turn around and say, I don't have time to stay healthy. How can I do this? And they're really, really struggling. And so initially it was kind of my own quest of there must be a way that we can combine high performance with optimal health. And that was really where it began. And then I retrained in nutrition and health coaching and nutritional therapy and started working more and more with clients and putting the pieces together while healing myself from all the depression. And that's where what I do, this health and performance coaching was born, really. It was out of that. Wow. So yeah, that's kind of the background on me.
Crazy story there. I mean, it would have been, really difficult around that time when you sort of departed law. So do you want to sort of, explain to my listeners, what are some of the things that you tapped into or leveraged at the time to sort of pull yourself back together when it comes to health?
So it's very difficult, isn't it? Because there's a mental aspect, there's a physical aspect, and then there's your spiritual health, which that was the piece that I'd never really focused on, was my spiritual health. So for me, we can come on to that in a minute, the kind of gratitude practices, meditation, those things actually going inwards have really helped me. But initially I was facing this mental and potentially physical health crisis, because by the time I was in hospital, they thought they were going to end up having to transfer me into intensive care and intubate me. I was neutropenic. It was bacterial and viral pneumonia on both lungs. So really, a lot of it, yes, they were giving me high-dose antibiotics, which I later had to recover from with my gut health and everything. But there was a viral component as well. So my own immune system was really having to step in at this point. And that left me physically, I lost a lot of weight. But what's really interesting was when I was in hospital, so many practitioners in the natural health area will talk about this mind-body connection. I really witnessed this myself, because there I was lying in the hospital bed, thinking about, I'd had all these thoughts of suicide. And really for me, there was this trap, because it was like, how can I do that and leave my kids and my family with no mother to grow up? But then I couldn't be with myself. And I think when I had these very, very high fevers in the hospital, it kind of gave way to a bit of lucidity, really. And it helped me tap into that inner peace. And I felt okay. And I was like, here I am. I've been trying to run away from myself. And now I'm in hospital and I can't get away from myself. But I felt this profound sense of peace. And I'm okay, and I'm okay being with me. So that was the switch. And my blood work changed literally within 48 hours of me making that mental switch, which is unbelievable when you think about it. And so my recovery then started to accelerate quicker than they were expecting, because I really connected with my children. And I was like, what the hell am I doing? They need a mum. Like, I want to see them grow up. I want to be there for them, in the fun parts, in the challenges, with everything. And I think that was the thing that really got to me. So when I came out, it was like, how can I get my physical health back? So I enrolled with a functional medicine practitioner in London, spoke to him, I'd lost a ton of weight. How could I build myself back up? And then also from a mental health perspective, I was having significant psychological therapy to really help me overcome that. And then the spiritual side came later, because I think, to be honest, when you can't sit with yourself, it's very difficult to say to people, you need to go within when you're that depressed. I certainly found that hard. But as I started to understand that, thoughts can be changed and that I am not my thoughts, I began to do that CBT style work, which then allowed me to go into the more spiritual side. And that has been transformational for me.
Wow. So I would love to dive deeper into that spiritual side of things. And, you sort of just mentioned there around the fact that we are not our thoughts. And let's sort of dive into, what did you do to sort of make that pronounced feeling, or I guess actually adhere to that sort of saying?
So initially it takes a lot of work, right? I'm not going to lie. It does take a lot of work, like anything. So, you're never going to put on lots of muscle mass and get strong without doing intense physical activity. And so initially it was about understanding those thoughts and capturing them. But you're so caught in your head. How can you understand how you felt, right? So a behavior or an action is generally driven by a feeling that's driven by an emotion that was originally a thought. So for me, it was like tracking back. How can I? And so sometimes I would just be standing there, at the kitchen island with my kids, just feeling this profound sense of depression, just struggling to go through the day and having to track back and think, what led to that thought? And then actually it was a case of going through it with the psychotherapist and writing down the thoughts and going, what is? I think, there's this concept of ants, which is automatic negative thoughts, and understanding, well, where did that thought come from and what was it? And now connecting, this has made me feel in this way. Now I've got this emotion in the body that I can physically feel. What could be a different thought that I could use? But even before that, you've got to track back and go, do I know this thought to be true? Do I really know it to be true? And ask yourself repeatedly those questions. And it really was writing it out. I used to have to go to see the psychotherapist with these sheets of paper, and almost I couldn't believe what I was thinking in my head. The other thing I think that's really hard for anyone that's listening that has struggled with clinical depression is that it becomes so physical. And so, it breaks my heart now when I think about it, but it used to take my eldest son maybe an hour and a half to 2 hours to get me out of bed to take him to school, because he'd be pulling me and it's so physical and you can't tell the difference. And I think that's one of the hardest things. And I remember one of my friends saying that, some mums would feel that I'd ignored them on the school run. And it wasn't that I'd ignored them. I was just trying so hard to hold it together. If anyone spoke to me, I think I would have burst into tears. It was like, I've just got to get through the day. And I remember the psychotherapist, I had quite a few, but there was one that was particularly good, saying to me, you've got to do less. And I was thinking, do less? Like, how can I do less? I used to run multinational deals, and now the biggest achievement is getting my son to school. Like, what's this concept of doing less? But it is about doing less to understand, right? You've almost got to go back and rewrite from within and find who you really are in that situation.
Wow. So, yeah, I guess with that, in terms of that, recuperating and sort of bouncing back and reinvigorating that spark again, what were some of the other modalities you sort of utilized, in conjunction with the psychotherapy? What else did you find was beneficial?
So exercise was a massive trigger for me, massive help, exercise, and it always had been. And I think that's the difficult is then it's about getting the balance right, because I turned to running, I was going out a lot, and I think that you can almost stress the body too much, right? Particularly for women. And I know we wanted to talk a little bit as well about sort of women's health and how that affects them. And so it was and I think that's where working with a functional medicine practitioner he had a very good personal trainer that I was speaking to as well. It was about getting that balance because we needed to build me back up. So exercise was definitely a lifeline. But then if I overdid it, I would be absolutely exhausted. So it was about getting that balance right for me, where we're not raising cortisol too high and we're still restoring the body to its original state. So that helped. I got really strong. I improved my diet immeasurably. So obviously when I'd had the PCOS, I'd realized a low carbohydrate diet was going to work better. Now I was focusing on really nutrient dense nutrition. I took, some things that actually helped to stabilize me. I had to have a lot of medication. This was, as I was saying, and it took me a very long time to come off them. But one of the things that I used was, I don't know if you've used this at all, is Stabilium, which is this very deep sea fish that was used by the Celts when they would go into battle. And these fish they basically take it when the fish come up to spawn and they take the oils from it. But these fish are deprived of any kind of light. So they're extremely resilient. And it's really, really interesting because it's used to help. It actually helps to improve your circadian rhythm as well. And that's one of the things that can really go off with depression, is that you really lose the ability to sleep well. And often it's used with people, for example, who are blind as well, because they don't have that circadian rhythm and those triggers. And it seems to help them sleep better. But it almost works on a kind of adaptogenic basis just to support you. So I used that with a really good blend of adaptogenic herbs, some strong B vitamins as well, just to give me that adrenal support and really start building myself back up from there.
Interesting. So that was called Stabilium, you said?
Stabilium. Yeah.
And it's basically it's different to like fish oil, but it's more of like an adaptogenic sea-based.
It's a type of fish, and it's a fish that's very, very deep below the ocean. And because of that, it makes them very resilient. And it seems to be, I've used it a lot with clients myself. It seems to really just moderate that HPA axis and just help to take the edge off things like anxiety. I wasn't specifically struggling so much with anxiety. I think depression and anxiety are flip sides of the same coin. And I think that's the thing. However, this did really, really help me, alongside, as I say, some strong B vitamins coupled with some adaptogens just to give me that support. So I was doing that, and then a nutrient-dense diet. And then it was also about retraining my sleep cycle, because the sleep had become so disrupted. And I think that's one of the hardest things for people with depression. So then it was doing a lot of the things that you and I both talk about. So actually getting outside, getting access to natural light, particularly early in the day, having a really good wind down routine and trying to relax in the evening, which, when you've got 3 kids under 5 is hard to do and they wake you up. But it was kind of, doing the best that I could with what I had, essentially.
What I'd love to dive into is more around what you did in terms of, the diet. You sort of mentioned a lower carbohydrate diet was beneficial in the context of PCOS. How did that sort of also affect your mood as well?
So with going on a more carbohydrate diet, I felt my concentration is much better. And that stayed with me because I think that when you have, and I've looked at my genetics, this sensitivity to carbohydrates, which obviously for me was playing out because I had that PCOS and the insulin resistance, you're much more prone to blood sugar highs and lows. And it's really interesting because I've been tracking that recently again with a continuous blood glucose monitor. And it's very interesting because I was looking actually just over this past week at my blood sugar, and it's really like within a really healthy range. It stays low. If anything, sometimes it can actually go a little bit too low, right? So I'm somebody who has a harder time controlling blood sugar. And then yesterday, as a bit of an experiment, I love sourdough. I was like, I just want to see what happens while I've got this on if I have unopposed carbs, right? What's going to happen? It had a tiny bit of nut butter on it, but it's just one piece and it literally shot up. So if you imagine my blood sugar's like kicking in around 4, I fasted all morning, had only black coffee. And the moment I have one slice of sourdough, it's not a lot, it shoots up to 10, which is unbelievable, to 10 with literally one slice. And that's the thing, okay? In somebody, and I think this is why I like people before they go on any kind of diet to understand from a genetic perspective, and obviously there's the microbiome and everything else, what are your sensitivities? Because in that scenario, and I've tested it, if I have protein with that changes the game completely because obviously it changes how we're processing the carbohydrates, which is really important. And my blood sugar will stay really, really stable. But that, once I got that under control, so I don't go super low carbs. And I think I've seen that cause a lot of problems for women in particular when they do because of the delicate female hormone balance. But what I do find is that keeping, relatively speaking, low carb is really helpful for me from a blood sugar perspective and also from a neurological perspective and my ability to concentrate and not have these swings. And it helps stabilize mood.
Interesting. What about timing of the carbohydrates? Have you ever sort of played around with that at all?
Yeah, I have a little bit, but it's hard to, I haven't been able to isolate whether that would happen because I've not ever had carbs unopposed in the evening. So I know, for example, that carbohydrates in the evening, I very much do find it helps you sleep better, right? Partly because I think when you're in a more ketogenic state, things like gluconeogenesis, you're actually using that cortisol cycle. So you're raising stress hormones so it can impact sleep. So I always have carbohydrates in the evening, but then I'm also having protein and fat. So that's an all-round balanced meal. So I wouldn't see a particularly big variation in blood sugar. It might go up to say 5.5, 5.8. It doesn't really vary in that scenario. I haven't tested just deciding to, I haven't experimented. Maybe I should just, trying just some carbs on their own in the evening for the sake of it.
I was recently having a chat with glucose goddess, Jessie, telling her to line up some experiments. There's one where it's like preloading, like before eating just pure white rice, you have like fruit just before it. And by preloading with fruit, somehow it lowers that postprandial glucose spike. So it would be, yeah, it's really
That's
crazy.
Interesting.
Yeah, like I'm going to do a
And that's what then having just carbs. So you preload with fruit and then you have white rice. Do you have any kind of protein or fats to moderate that response?
That would be ideal. Like obviously we both know adding protein and fat is beneficial, but in this study that they did, they literally just preloaded with like apples. They had like apples before white rice and it lowered the spike post meal, which is pretty interesting. Again, like there's so much fun you can have with the CGM.
Yeah.
What else?
But do you think that's down to like the pectin that's like lowering the stomach emptying? So it's actually slowing down the emptying of the stomach. And so maybe somehow that's leading to a less rise in rapid glucose. Potentially,
yeah, it could be. And some of the polyphenols in apples may have some insulin releasing property.
True. Yeah.
But, yeah, it is fun. Like when you can experiment. What else have you done with the CGM or things that you've discovered so far?
Well, I tell you what is interesting is when I've worked out, and so this wasn't actually when I was wearing CGM, but understanding that I had this high carb sensitivity, utilizing that in a deliberate way to spike blood sugar post weight training, I got amazing results. So I actually did an experiment on myself where I wanted to get into like the best shape of my life, if you like. And so I was doing a lot of training. I actually removed most cardio apart from walking, concentrated just on strength training. And I put on so much muscle mass that I literally then, my husband was like, okay, this doesn't look good anymore. This is, you going like 6-pack, now it's going down to 8-pack. And I was deliberately spiking blood sugar after training to help kind of get that glycogen back into the muscle. And working really hard. I got very strong. I was then able to which a lot of women struggle with, right? When you can do your own pull-ups completely unassisted. I could do all of that. But he was a bit like, actually, this doesn't look that good anymore. You've kind of gone a bit far with it. So I have used it in that way. And I think maybe being more sensitive to carbs in that scenario can be helpful. I've tried other things like, what's the effect of black coffee? That does definitely, and I think that's always an interesting one, right? That does raise blood sugar. So even in a fasted state, but then you sort of expect that in the morning. I don't find one thing I don't do, and I don't know about you, like for example, I don't eat carbs at lunchtime. For me, that is the point in the day that actually it would impact my productivity the most, much more so than if I had it at breakfast, for example. That would be less of an issue because I think I'm an early morning person. So I'm pretty switched on in the morning. Whereas if I have carbs at lunchtime, I actually would see much more of a postprandial dip. And I find that there's a bigger impact on blood sugar as well. I don't know what you found, Lucas.
Yeah, I'm pretty similar. What you said before about when you push the carbohydrates back in the evening, I have been deliberately doing that. I've been pushing a lot of my carbs later towards the end of the day, and I feel like I get awesome sleeps, even though it goes against completely what you read in the literature where it says don't have too many carbohydrates in the evening. But I definitely notice the anti-cortisol, anti-adrenaline, parasympathetic effect that you get from carbohydrates. It just tames things down a bit, particularly when it's combined with protein as well.
I've definitely found that, and I sleep a lot better. I think alcohol's a difficult one because alcohol, I notice when you're wearing a CGM, pushes blood sugar down, is what I've noticed. And I think that's obviously why it's such a risk factor for a type 1 diabetic, right? They can actually go into a fit if they drink alcohol.
What type of alcohol are we talking about?
So I'm talking about if I have a glass of wine with a meal, the blood sugar response will be less with a carbohydrate containing meal. But again, I'm doing more tracking on that. And again, how do you account for what that is? Because it's a little bit like the apple. There's a high polyphenol content, right, in something like a really good biodynamic red wine. And again, I always think with alcohol, this is really interesting because when the research comes out and says alcohol is bad, I think that there's a lot of things that alcohol in itself is bad, but then there's a lot of variations between what people are drinking, right? So somebody that buys a supermarket bottle of wine that honestly doesn't have much love put into it necessarily and seems to have a lot of chemicals and sulfites and things compared to a biodynamically farmed organic wine that's from a really small vineyard. And, in Europe, we're lucky enough to have access to a lot of those types of wines. I think they're very different. How do you even compare like to like on that?
Yeah, it's a really good point. The quality of the alcohol is going to influence the response as well. I'd like to go back to, you sort of mentioned around the protein intake. You sort of mentioned you're having a lot of carbohydrates post-workout, but what was your protein intake like during that period of time when you're gaining a lot of muscle?
Yeah, so protein was really high. Protein was high. I mean, I was aiming for 1 gram per pound of body weight. So that was high. And I found that to be a very useful metabolic trigger with women. They feel much more satiated when they increase their protein to that degree. And I've also found that it leads to body composition changes very quickly. The most important one, I would say, for me, actually, when I've looked at it, is once you break your fast, having protein in that first meal. I know lots of people do go for things like bulletproof coffee. And I think, being in a ketogenic state is muscle preserving, doesn't necessarily create that same trigger. However, I don't enjoy really the taste of bulletproof. So
Yeah.
It's not something I use.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think breaking the fast with some degree of at least 30 grams, 30 to 40 grams of protein is ideal. Now, I just, in general, I think that we should be aiming for about, even sometimes aim for like 40 to 45 grams of protein per meal. But in terms of the fasting side of things, like, have you experimented much with like longer term fasting, like longer duration fasts?
Yeah, so when I've done, in terms of longer fasts, I find that my body gets under significant stress. I can actually feel that stress. I don't find it really works for me. And I think that the thing with fasting, right, is, as you know, a lot of the studies have been done in mice for sort of autophagy and also in longevity, and then also sedentary, obese men. There hasn't been as much research done on women, particularly who exercise a lot. And I think the way I see it is hormesis is amazing, right? So if we can produce a hormetic stress, so that is a stress, a physical stress on the body that's going to make it more resilient and stronger. For those listening who might, most of your listeners, I'm sure, are very familiar with that term. However, there's so many different types of stress that you can create. And I think for women in particular, what's coming out more and more is that if you layer these on in too many of them at any one time, it actually can disrupt their delicate hormonal cycle in terms of estrogen and progesterone. And that's certainly what I find, and it happens with me quite quickly, is I could then see a drop in hormones if I fast or take my carbs too low, that it will actually then drop my cycle. But then I'm quite lean, I'm low body fat percentage anyway. So I think it's got to be such an individual thing. Whereas if you have a sedentary woman who's got a lot of weight to lose, I think it doesn't necessarily always cause that same effect, and it can be quite positive. I do always practice religiously a 12-hour overnight fast. And I find often pretty much every day it goes beyond that. It's like 14, 15 hours. For me, the friction starts to come in when I go beyond that, because then it's actually difficult to get as many calories into me as I need because I exercise a lot. And I think that's where for women it becomes very individual. You've got to look at how many of these things are you doing that are stimulating that process before you start raising inflammation and cortisol, because the more cortisol more than anything else, because the body's becoming overstressed. And then that can start to downregulate not just sex hormones, but thyroid function as well. And it's quite interesting because I've seen, women that have done very restrictive diets, like a very intense ketogenic protocol, and they might have done that for 12 months. And when they come and their periods completely stop and they're in their mid-40s and they're wondering, have I hit menopause? And then they come off the ketogenic diet, they start to bring in whole food carbs and have more of a plant-based diet, and their menstrual cycle returns. And so I think it's a very delicate balance. And even that whole year off, we know that ovulation is an important thing. And, having as many cycles as you can in the lead up to menopause is important, because you're paying deposits in terms of your cognitive health, your bone health, your metabolic health. I think it's quite key. So I go easy with women and with myself, particularly if they exercise significantly. That's what I found.
This is brilliant, because I'd love to, get stuck into more around the perimenopause, and also maybe did you want to start with what are the implications of some of the dangers associated with a low carbohydrate diet on that HPO axis?
Yeah. I think what's difficult is obviously there's a hormone kisspeptin that starts off this whole mechanism. And I think that in some women, some of the research that I've been looking at recently, and there isn't lots and lots of research, is that for some women, for example, who are on the edge, they might be, so we know that in perimenopause, insulin sensitivity often is slightly downregulated, cortisol is higher. So you may have women who've actually got weight to lose and they're pre-diabetic. Sometimes doing very extreme fasting protocols or restrictive diets like the ketogenic diet actually doesn't, and can tip them into a worse position in terms of their blood sugar management, which is completely unexpected, right? Because the research on men says otherwise. Men get great neurological benefits. Their cognition is much better. It seems like they get better lipid profiles. It reduces cholesterol, improves insulin sensitivity. Whereas in women, we don't always see that. There may be some improvements to things like HDL, but there aren't necessarily big improvements to LDL, which is obviously a type of cholesterol that we, particularly when it becomes oxidized, worry more about. And so I think in that section of the population, we actually have to be even more careful, because what we're trying to do is optimize progesterone production. And during this period, women, yes, they're getting drops in estrogen, but progesterone seems to be dropping first because we start to see them have anovulatory cycles. So even though, and I think that's why it's useful for women to track and actually understand, did I ovulate this month and how many ovulation events am I getting? And the Aura Ring actually is a really good way of doing that. And I think Whoop have changed their strap now so that you can, on the new model, you can actually track body temperature. So that was one of the main reasons I've been experimenting and comparing Aura and Whoop on myself and the data that I get. I actually like to see that change in body temperature because it's without going and doing an ovulation test, it's confirmation. Often I can tell anyway, but you'll see that body temperature rise. And I think it's important for women to, if you don't ovulate that month, because a lot of women complain, and when they come to see me, they've got crippling anxiety, and anxiety is increased as progesterone production gets downregulated. And so if they haven't ovulated, once you ovulate, just for people listening, you have the egg comes out of the corpus luteum, which is this temporary gland. And that temporary gland that's left behind produces the bulk of the progesterone. Some of it is produced by the adrenal glands. Now, when you're in the very early stages of your period, we're relying to a degree on the adrenals to pick up this progesterone production, and that lightens the period and brings it shorter. And what women are experiencing often in perimenopause is these very heavy periods at the beginning when they first go into it, and these shorter cycles. So we want to try and give their body what it needs to optimize progesterone production. And a lot of that is about helping to reduce stress. So if we're then layering on all these other metabolic triggers and things which for men work extremely well, it can overstress them too much, is what I found.
This is brilliant. This is really good because, it's sort of matching up. There's a lot of similarities in terms of the pro-metabolic, pro-longevity effects of progesterone. It does seem like, we're seeing reductions in that progesterone as women age. So did you want to sort of explain what are some of the key nutrients that may help to, support progesterone production?
Yeah, so I think when you're looking, for good kind of hormonal cycling and good estrogen and progesterone production, right? So I always think of estrogen is like the charismatic guest at the party, right? So estrogen is amazing. Estrogen's a great trigger for stimulating muscle mass, right? Estrogen makes your skin look amazing. It makes you feel good in certain amounts. Okay, if estrogen gets too much of a handle, that's when you can get a lot of problems when there isn't progesterone. So I kind of think of progesterone is almost like Princess Progesterone. She kind of comes in, but she's a bit quieter. You have to usher her in a bit, and it's really important that she does come in mid-cycle and that you do get good levels, because if you don't, you're not offsetting, and that's when you get estrogen dominance, right? And so actually having really good vitamin status is important in terms of things like zinc, iron levels, B vitamins, really important. So all of the things, omega-3s, that you would look at in terms of fertility are really important to get the balance of that right. What I haven't seen, and I haven't seen scientific literature to support this, but I have seen anecdotally a lot of women finding really good results with it, and I've seen it in my own practice, is actually cycling with seeds to help the production of those hormones. So having like flaxseed and pumpkin, I hope I'm remembering my rotations right, at the beginning of the month, and then having sesame and sunflower at the end of the month helps to seem to offset things like PMS. In the early stages of perimenopause, maca actually works quite well. So adding maca to smoothies and things can help with progesterone production. But I think it's a lifestyle factor as well, because we've got to be moderating that stress and controlling that HPA axis, because otherwise, if the adrenals are constantly pumping out adrenaline and cortisol all of the time, they're not prioritizing progesterone. And I think this is really common in successful women who have, leadership positions, high performing roles, kind of like me when I was a corporate lawyer, and they've got children thrown into the mix, and then they've got other pressures. Often it's time of their life. They might have aging parents. They've got so much going in. going on, teenage children, their stress levels are very, very high, and they've maybe compromised on sleep as well. And so if they're utilizing things that then deliberately stimulate too much in one direction or the other, it compounds the problems of hormones. So that typical sort of behavior of somebody who's very highly stressed and high performing, they might use a lot of caffeine to warm up and wine to cool down. That really aggravates things like hot flashes and things like that at night. I find that alcohol is very hard to tolerate often for women in perimenopause.
Interesting. I'd sort of like to switch gears a little bit and sort of discuss iron deficiency and how common is it in women going through menopause and perimenopause?
I think it's really common from what I see. So I don't know what it's like in Australia, but I feel, and it's not just in the UK, I had a client very recently in Germany, her iron levels were very, very low, but the doctors don't pick it up and they don't get involved. And I think when you're looking at ferritin stores, often, they'll say, well, if it's below 20, we'll pay attention, right? But actually, it should be much higher. For a woman to feel good, her iron's got to be kind of 50, 60, maybe up to 80. So there's this big disparity. And I think they're not being treated in that situation. And then it gets lower and lower. And what I've seen happen is then it can go into full-blown anemia. And it's very difficult as well in women that are having a vegetarian-based diet because it is harder to absorb it. Meat has got heme iron, which is much more bioavailable to the body. And so I think it's a really difficult balance. And people are on different diets for different reasons. I would never judge that. But I think it's just having awareness that it's sometimes, if you're going to just use supplementation because you're not getting it from animal protein, obviously, you want to be having things like seafood, which can help to remineralize in the menstrual phase of your cycle. But it may be that you've got to kind of take a bit more in terms of supplementation. It's going to take a bit longer. And so don't leave it too late, because I've suffered with iron deficiency and concentration levels become so hard. You feel like your head's kind of stuffed full of cotton wool, and you just can't bring your attention to it as well. And, for me, I ended up actually at one point not long ago having an iron infusion because that gave me a result very, very quickly. But again, that needs careful monitoring, right? You've got to have that under medical supervision. Some people can get quite bad reactions from it. So I think I would say to women listening that monitoring your iron levels and taking control of that, I think the more we take control of our health and actually it's not difficult here in the UK to do blood work. You can order blood tests online and start to get a feel for where you are on certain things is really, really helpful, because your doctor may turn around and frequently does say everything's fine, when actually really it might be, but it might mean you're not yet got disease. I feel like doctors often really what they're saying is, you're not quite ready for me yet. And it's like, who wants to get ready, right? That's actually what you really want to do is improve your health.
It's a good way of looking at it. I've never thought of it like that. It totally makes sense, just the way that they view health. I actually made myself iron deficient, not on purpose, but I was donating blood too often. And then I also was like smashing heaps of curcumin. I was mega dosing like vitamin B1. I was taking like vitamin E, and I had, poor absorption as well. So I ended up, I know how it feels to be low in iron.
Interesting.
It doesn't feel good.
It doesn't, does it? It's really hard. I think that's one thing. And I think the other thing that people underestimate, right, is omega-3s are amazing. Like, that's something I take. I just think it's so important in terms of like keeping inflammation low and helping with cognitive health. Omega-3s are amazing. They're one of the few supplements that if I don't take, I definitely notice a difference.
Yeah, omega-3s can be, really powerful for certain individuals with, abnormal neuronal signaling or phospholipid synthesis and things like that. I would love to dive into like the sleep aspect around menopause. Obviously, that's something that would be heavily affected. What do you do there to sort of support sleep?
So one of the first things, as we were saying, is obviously taking alcohol out is ideal, or at least moderating it, because it does seem to cause more night sweats and hot flashes, and obviously your body's trying to do so many things. I find that magnesium coupled with taurine can actually help women sleep better. That can be a really good thing. magnesium bisglycinate, just because it kind of really is very calming. The other thing as well, in terms of adaptogens, is ashwagandha can work really well, sometimes coupled with holy basil. So that can help, but getting really, really disciplined on your sleep routine is really important. And I think more than ever before. So understanding like all of the things that you and I both talk about in terms of moderating blue light, particularly trying to have a wind down routine, creating some separation between when you finish work, or people are addicted to social media and looking at things on their phone or trying to clear another email before bed. All of that stuff becomes really important. From my own perspective, in terms of experimentation and stuff I've used more recently with clients, I actually find that magnesium coupled with a tincture of reishi and a tincture of chaga gives a really amazing night's sleep. I've got really, really into mushrooms. I'm playing with the lion's mane because I do notice an interest in REM sleep, but I don't know if my brain's just a little bit more active when I take that, whereas the reishi and the chaga seems to give me a really, really calm sleep.
Yeah, wild dreams with, like crazy dreams with the lion's mane, or you haven't noticed that yet?
I haven't had crazy dreams. I wanted to, but I haven't. I did notice my REM sleep, but it just increased. But I don't know, there's just a little bit more. I mean, I take lion's mane because I've got one copy of APOE4, so that's always a concern to me. So because for those listening, that's one copy of the gene that's associated with Alzheimer's, right? So generally, if you've got two copies of APOE3, I think your risk of Alzheimer's is about 9%. If you have one copy of APOE4, it goes up to 30%, and if you have two copies, to 50%, right? So sleep is one of the most important things here in terms of getting that glymphatic system, which is when the cerebral spinal fluid comes up and sort of washes the brain and helps clear a lot of the plaque and amyloid plaque and tau proteins and things that we can see build up. And obviously there's research showing now, early research, that lion's mane can help to enhance nerve growth factor and the connection between neurons. So for me, that coupled with sleep, but I'm tending to take it earlier in the day because I don't know, sometimes I take it at night. I can't seem to get clarity. I think I need to journal it a bit more on how well it works at night.
Yeah.
I don't know what you found. Have you had crazy dreams then with lion's mane?
Yeah, back in the day, I had like an ethanol-based extract of lion's mane. It was actually from a company in the US called Powder City. It's like the OG vendor for like nootropics. I used to use that particular lion's mane. I used to have it like 10 to 15 minutes before bed because every time I'd use it, it would literally just knock me out. Like just, it makes me wonder whether it actually was, whether it was lion's mane.
The alcohol. Yeah, whether it was lion's mane.
Yeah. But I think, it can be beneficial for certain individuals with, like you said, risk factor for Alzheimer's. It can help to, reduce that plaque formation, improve cognitive function. The other one that you mentioned with reishi mushroom, I've done a fair bit of research on that one. Have you seen, like, from a traditional Chinese medicine perspective, they talk about it as like a Shen tonic, which is the spiritual, improving that spiritual awareness.
Well, I think I've noticed it's difficult, isn't it? Because how do you take one thing or another? So in terms of that spiritual side and the connection, that's something I've been really playing with anyway and trying different modalities, because I've been trying to play with different types of meditation as well as part of this journey, because the spiritual side, I don't know what you find, but I find this is the area where the more you go into it, it's like a well that you drink from. It really is soul food. Like Oprah talks about soul food. And I think it's so true because it really is. And so I think, yes, I do feel a more like profound state of calm when I've had the reishi. I do notice that. However, I think that the practices that I've been doing in terms of connection are also helping as well at the same time, and deepening those practices and reading more spiritual books and things as well. So it's difficult to distinguish.
Yeah. How do you go about, by the way, tracking and logging your day-to-day experiences or experiments? Like, do you have like a certain practice for that?
So I've been playing with something, and at the moment, I don't know if I might at some point like launch this in a physical format, but I have a journal that I've called Female Biohacker that I journal in every day. And I don't take on a lot of one-to-one clients, but my female one-to-one clients are utilizing it and trialing it at the moment. And they've found it really interesting because in there I've combined the ability, and this is what I use myself. So the ability to track all my aura data so I can actually see what's going on, track where I am in my menstrual cycle, track what my energy is when I'm awaking, how I feel, what the reason for that energy score is, how I might improve it, future pacing my day, so what I want to happen in my day and getting really, really clear. And then there's a gratitude practice that I do. So there's a lot of space for that. I really like this idea of writing out what you're grateful for and then why. I find the why makes the gratitude practice so much more powerful. So it's kind of like, I'm truly blessed for X because, and then reading, or I'm so happy and grateful for X because. But the real thing that I've found is sometimes people write out gratitude because they feel like they should. And then they're sort of like, oh, I don't know, I'm not feeling it. When you go back and read your gratitude list, that's when the deepest connection comes, I find. Because then when you're no longer writing it and you're reading it back, you can enter into the real spirit of what that is. And then, tracking things that I'm eating, using things like the CGM, and then looking back, one of the biggest things I've noticed, I don't know if you do this, Lucas, is reflecting on the day and how well it went and what happened and what the learning experiences from that day were, both in terms of my health and my business and my relationships. And then really asking a question. I found a really powerful question is, what could have made today even better? Because often we can really criticize what we think didn't go as well without appreciating what did go well. So if you reframe that to what could have gone even better, I think it just really sets you up for a great day the next day.
They're really great, really, really cool suggestions. I've never, in terms of like that first one, actually reading back what you're grateful for, because I do the same thing. Like I'll just write down what I'm grateful for, but then I don't really, think back and appreciate it. Like it's just very material, but I think it's a really good point with
it's really powerful when you read it. And sometimes you go back over it and you're just like, thank you, but you really feel that connection because you're like, wow. Because sometimes you might write it and you might think that was a really amazing moment, like stepping outside and watching the sunrise and having a coffee, or reading to my daughter in bed. There's really like simple moments that you cherish, and when you're writing it you kind of feel a connection. But when you then read it back, your own words, it takes you into that moment that happened again, and you can actually feel it. It's quite visceral, much more sensory. So yeah, it's something that I've really enjoyed, and my clients have really enjoyed since we've developed that practice.
Yeah, I really like that. And I also, I think it's absolutely integral when it comes to biohacking to do some degree of tracking, not over the top. Obviously, we want to actually, because it can get to a degree, it can become very orthorexic. I mean, I've stepped into that realm myself when you're so overly conscious of your decisions and behaviors that you're almost over analytically tracking things. But I do think there needs to be some degree of tracking to build up that self-awareness, because it's hard to keep track of things all in our head. Like there's so many different things going on.
Yeah, I agree. And I agree with you. I think it can become obsessive, and we don't ever want to become obsessive about something. And so I think it's about understanding, is not feeling bound to it, but is this improving my life? And if it is making an immeasurable improvement and difference, then I continue with it. But otherwise, I completely agree with you. And even things like the CGM, right? I do it for periods of time because I want to make sure I'm on track and not go off course. But then I don't do it 12 months of the year, because then it would feel obsessive, right? And be constantly scanning my arm. It becomes quite addictive, doesn't it? You're like, oh, I wonder what my blood sugar is now. Oh, I wonder.
I only had one I've only used it once, and I'm just desperate to get my hands on another one. Like it's literally impossible to get it here in Australia. We can't even.
Is it?
Can't even go on eBay. Can't even go on, like, it's honestly the hardest thing to get. My dad's a pharmacist, and we own a pharmacy, but it's just like it's so hard to get your hands on without a script. It's just ridiculous.
Oh, wow. Because I've been trying different interfaces on that. So obviously Freestyle Libre is the key kind of manufacturer that have always made it. And their interface isn't that great. And so I then have been trying a company called Very Stable, and there's another one, NutriSense, that I'm about to try. And it's quite interesting because you then upload their app and they give you a different interface. I've noticed that Very Stable, it's called keep you within a very now it's quite strict. I think it's made for biohackers because it's kind of like you can't really delve outside of it at all. Do you know what I mean? So it's definitely keeping me on track. But yeah, they're all so different. I have to send you one from the UK so you can do it again.
Please, yeah. I did, when I actually got my hands on one, I did a really cool experiment. I did post it on Instagram. I had 100 grams of white sugar, 100 grams of white sugar in water.
Wow.
And this was after like a 4K, 5K walk, and crazy. Everyone's like freaking out. Like, how is this possible? It barely budged.
Really?
There was hardly any spike at all. And I was waiting, I kept testing, and I'm like,
no, that's so interesting.
Yeah.
Do you know why that fascinates me so much? I don't know. I'd love to hear why you think that happened, because I was going to share that my husband and I did an experiment. So we both had CGMs on. We've looked at our genetics. I'm very carb sensitive. He isn't. So it was really interesting. And he made a really big celery and carrot juice. Now, obviously the carrot gives you potentially more of a glycemic response. And I think he'd put one apple in there. So not a lot, right? And it was like, what's going to happen? This was crazy. His blood sugar stayed relatively normal. Mine shot up to over 12.
Over 12.
And it's like that's do you know, it's probably one of the most frustrating things is that, as I say, mine's like constantly now, because I know what I'm doing, in and around, you know, somewhere between, actually it goes quite low, 3 point something up to about 5.5. And yet if I do something like that a lot of people would say is healthy, right? Juicing on an empty stomach, you've removed the fiber, it's an unopposed carb. In someone like me, it gives a crazy blood sugar spike. So no matter the vitamins that I might have got from that drink, that's still not good for my body.
Crazy. Yeah, these are the experiments we need to like just collate and log. Like, have you started saving these to your Instagram stories at all, or?
I need to I'm about to do some more, because I've been putting quite a bit together on the basis of this one. And then I'm going to do, because people get really interested. And I think that's the thing we need to understand, right? Is that we're so different. I mean, what do you think was the reason for you having that much sugar and not seeing a difference?
Well, when I looked back at the experiment, obviously it was post-exercise. It was a decent walk. I would say it was about 65% of my max heart rate intensity. It wasn't a jog, but it was a brisk, powerful walk. And I hadn't eaten in about like 3 to 4 hours prior to that. But then when I came back, I was very hungry, and I was probably a little bit dehydrated. But then when I, had the whole glass of water and I drank that, maybe my body was really just responsive to the sugar and just really just needed the sugar and disposed it really well. It could have been because I may have used some GDAs, like glucose disposal agents. I think I had like bitter melon early that morning. But these are the experiments that I want to start doing them again. If I had the access that you have access, like I think I'd be wearing it every day.
All the time. It is really addictive. I want to try it with, I was chatting to Wade Lightheart the other day about his new blood glucose control. And so I've actually got some of that coming. So I'm going to see and do deliberate experiments and see, because he's packed that with so many things to bring blood sugar down. And so, I'm going to experiment with that and see what the effects are. I know when I've done, for example, like worn a blood sugar monitor and had a carbohydrate containing food and used Ben's Keon Lean, then I definitely see less of a blood sugar response than if I hadn't taken the Keon Lean. So I think things like bitter melon extract, berberine, all the research shows they work, and they do work because when you use them. And so they're very interesting for someone like myself, right, who has to work. It just sounds like I've got to work harder than you. I've got to work harder than my husband at controlling it. And I think for people like me, these things are really, really helpful.
Yeah. Well, please do, if you do like post them, make sure you save them to your stories so I can reshare some of the things you find.
Amazing. Thank you. Yeah, well.
So I guess, Ange, that pretty much, wraps up the episode. Do you want to let my listeners know where they can connect with you, where they can find you and work with you as well?
Yeah, sure. So my website's angelafosterperformance.com. And then this concept of health and high performance, my podcast is High Performance Health. So they can have a listen to that. I'm always on Instagram at Angela S. Foster. And if they want to do a kind of fun questionnaire to look at, I have a kind of protocol called SHIFT, which is sleep, hormones, insights, fuel, and training, and find out where they are and get a health score. They can go to yourtotalhealthcheck.com, and it's quite a fun interactive questionnaire. And then they get a personalized report there as well.
Awesome. So I'll make sure to link those in the show notes for those listening in. But yeah, Angela, thanks for coming on the show. It's been a fun chat.
Thanks so much, Lucas. I've really, really enjoyed it.
Awesome.